In May 2003, a president sat at a heavy wooden desk in Abuja and picked up a pen. President Olusegun Obasanjo did not ask the National Assembly for a debate. He did not hold a public hearing. He simply signed an executive directive authorizing the immediate liquidation of Nigeria Airways. With one stroke of ink, the national carrier was erased from the sky. Over 6,000 pilots, engineers, and cabin crew lost their jobs on the exact same day. The government sent armed police to the airports. They locked the heavy iron gates to the hangars. But that is not where the money stops. By law, when a multi-million-dollar corporation is liquidated, its physical assets are sold. The money generated from that sale is deposited into a strict escrow account. The very first people legally entitled to that money are the employees. The law demands they receive their severance and their pensions. Look at the reality. Today, more than 2 decades after that signature, the workers have not been fully paid. Over 2,000 of them have died waiting for their checks. The government claims there is no money. But Nigeria Airways did not just own airplanes. They owned prime real estate in London, Rome, and New York. They owned massive residential estates in GRA, Ikeja. They owned the most expensive, invisible assets in the aviation industry, international landing slots. Those assets did not disappear. They were transferred. They were sold. The buyers wired the cash. So where did the money go? I am a forensic investigator. Today we are opening the files on the ultimate corporate slaughter. We are naming the men who stripped a billion-dollar national asset and forced the workers to pay the bill with their lives. You are watching Historic Capital. This is the dossier on the Nigeria Airways liquidation cartel. If you want to steal a massive national asset, you do not just steal it. You must first convince the public that the asset is worthless. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Nigeria Airways was deliberately starved of funding. The government refused to maintain the aircraft. Flights were cancelled. Passengers were stranded. The media called the airline a national embarrassment. The decay was manufactured. Once the airline's reputation was destroyed, the politicians moved in to harvest the remains. Look closely at what happens next. In 2002, the Minister of Aviation was a woman named Kema Chikwe. She traveled to London and negotiated a secret deal. She signed an agreement to hand over the routes and assets of Nigeria Airways to a foreign company called Airwing Aerospace. She created a new entity called Air Nigeria. She gave the foreign company 51% of the national carrier. But financial investigators dug into Airwing Aerospace. They checked the corporate registry in the United Kingdom. They found a terrifying reality. Airwing Aerospace did not own a single airplane. They had no track record in global aviation. They were a paper company. The Nigerian Minister of Aviation had signed away the national carrier to a shell corporation. Then something changed. The Nigerian public and the aviation unions found out. The outcry was massive. President Obasanjo was forced to cancel the Airwing deal, but the cartel did not stop. They simply changed the partner. In 2004, the Nigerian government invited the British billionaire Sir Richard Branson to Abuja. Branson owned Virgin Atlantic. The Nigerian government signed a deal with him to create a new airline called Virgin Nigeria. The Nigerian government gave Virgin Nigeria the exclusive rights to fly the lucrative international routes that previously belonged to Nigeria Airways. They handed a private British billionaire the sovereign aviation wealth of the Nigerian state. Nigeria owned the airspace, but not the profit. And the 6,000 fired workers of Nigeria Airways watched from the streets as foreign planes painted in virgin red took off from the exact same runways they had built. But the routes were just the beginning. When a company dies, the liquidator holds the knife. The Nigerian government appointed an official liquidation firm named Babington, Ashe & Co. The job of the liquidator is simple. You find the assets, you sell them at the highest global market value, and you use the cash to pay the debts. Let us look at the inventory. Nigeria Airways owned a massive corporate building at 1112 Conduit Street in Mayfair, London. Mayfair is one of the most expensive zip codes on planet Earth. A commercial building there is worth tens of millions of British pounds. The liquidators put the building up for sale, quietly. In forensic accounting, the easiest way to steal money during a liquidation is through undervaluation. You do not sell the building for £20 million. On the open market, you sell the building to a shadow company for £5 million. The shadow company is secretly controlled by a Nigerian politician or his frontman. The shadow company immediately flips the building a year later for its true value of £20 million. The Nigerian treasury gets £5 million. The politician pockets £15 million in pure, untraceable profit. The London property was sold. The properties in Rome were sold. Inside Nigeria, the airline owned massive residential plots. They owned the Sky Power estate in GRA Ikeja. They owned prime land in Ayobo. These properties were carved up. Military generals, federal ministers, and aviation executives bought the luxury duplexes for absolute pennies. They transferred the deeds into the names of their wives and their holding companies. The physical wealth of the airline was successfully converted into the private wealth of the elite. The money never stayed. But the most valuable asset of all was invisible. Nigeria Airways owned prime landing slots at London Heathrow and the John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. At Heathrow, a single primetime landing slot can be sold to another airline for $30 million to $50 million. When Nigeria Airways was liquidated, those slots were quietly absorbed by foreign carriers. The British and American airlines took the slots. Hundreds of millions of dollars in sovereign value vanished into the global aviation market. The assets were fully stripped, but the workers were still waiting. If a government does not want to pay a debt, they do not tell you no. They tell you to fill out a form. For the next 10 years, the Ministry of Aviation and the Ministry of Finance played a cruel administrative game. They called it the verification exercise. They announced on the radio that the former Nigeria Airways workers must travel to Abuja or Lagos to verify their identities before they could be paid. Think about that. A 70-year-old retired pilot who has not received a salary in a decade is forced to borrow money for a bus ticket. He travels across the country. He stands in the burning sun for 10 hours outside a government office. He presents his original employment letter. He presents his passport. A government clerk stamps his file. The pilot goes home and waits for the bank alert. The alert never comes. 2 years later, a new Minister of Finance is appointed. The new minister announces that the previous verification database was corrupted. He demands that all the workers must return to Abuja and do it again. They repeated this process in 2007. They repeated it in 2013. They repeated it in 2018. No one noticed. This is not administrative incompetence. It is a psychological and financial weapon. The government uses bureaucracy to exhaust the creditor. They know that the workers are old. They know they are sick. They drag out the paperwork because every month they delay the payment. The government keeps the cash in the central bank. The money generates interest for the state, while the worker starves in the street. The delay is the strategy. And as the years dragged on, the government deployed its most devastating weapon of all. Why does the cartel fight so hard to delay the payment? Because time destroys the currency. Let us look at the exact mathematics of this crime. When Nigeria Airways was liquidated in 2003, the exchange rate was roughly 130 naira to one United States dollar. If a senior aviation engineer was owed a severance package of 13 million naira in 2003, that money was worth exactly $100,000. With $100,000, that engineer could buy a house. He could send his children to a university in the UK. He could build a business. The government locks his 13 million naira in the treasury. They force him to wait. 14 years pass. In 2017, President Muhammadu Buhari finally signs an executive order. He approves a partial payment for the workers. The Ministry of Finance, operating under the Presidential Initiative on Continuous Audit, PICA, finally processes the check. They wire the engineer his 13 million naira. But look closely at what happens next. In 2017, the exchange rate had crashed to 360 naira to the dollar. That exact same 13 million naira is no longer worth $100,000. It is now worth $36,000. The government did not touch the principal. They simply held the money until the central bank devalued the currency. They legally wiped out 64% of the engineers' wealth without firing a single bullet. And for the workers who are still waiting for the balance of their money today, the math is completely catastrophic. Today, the exchange rate has crossed 1,500 naira to the dollar. The 13 million naira severance that was worth $100,000 when the airline died is now worth less than $8,600. The government does not need to deny the payment anymore. The inflation has already stolen it. Even when the government finally opened the vault, they rigged the transaction. President Buhari signed an authorization to release 45 billion naira to pay the final severance packages. The workers celebrated in the streets. They held church services. They thought the 20-year nightmare was over. Then the Ministry of Finance intercepted the joy. They announced that they would not release the full 45 billion naira. They claimed the country was facing a revenue shortfall. They decided they would only pay 50% of the approved amount. They released 22.6 billion naira. They promised the workers that the remaining balance would be paid shortly. That promise was made in 2018. The politicians who made that promise finished their terms in office. They collected their own massive severance packages. They received bulletproof SUVs and lifetime pensions from the state. The 22.6 billion naira balance was absorbed back into the federal budget. It was used to service foreign debt. It was used to fund the security votes of the governors. The government took the retirement funds of the working class and used it to finance the political class. We measure financial crimes in naira and dollars, but we must measure this specific crime in human lives. The National Union of Pensioners keeps a ledger. It is not a bank ledger, it is a death registry. Since the liquidation in 2003, over 2,000 former employees of Nigeria Airways have died. They did not die of old age, they died of treatable diseases. A former captain who flew Nigerian presidents across the globe suffered a stroke. Because his pension was withheld, he could not afford the physical therapy. He died in his bedroom. An aviation engineer developed diabetes. He could not afford the imported insulin because the naira crashed. He died in a public hospital ward. This affects you. When a government deliberately withholds the survival funds of its most dedicated civil servants, it is executing a silent massacre. The death of a pensioner is not a tragedy to the cartel. It is a corporate victory. Every time an elderly worker dies in Kano or Enugu, the government permanently crosses a name off the liability sheet. Dead men do not protest. Dead men do not hire lawyers. Dead men do not stand in line for verification exercises. When the worker dies, the unpaid pension simply dissolves into the treasury. The cartel uses mortality as a debt cancellation strategy. Nigeria owned the airline, but not the profit. The politicians stripped the assets, devalued the currency, and waited for the owners of the money to simply expire. We watched the government announce the launch of new national carriers. We watched them sign multi-million-dollar contracts with foreign airlines in Dubai and London. We celebrate the new airplanes. But you cannot build the future of a nation on the graves of the men who built the past. The story of Nigeria Airways is the ultimate autopsy of the Nigerian labor contract. It proves that the state does not view the citizen as a partner. It views the citizen as a disposable battery. They plug you into the machine. You fly the planes, you fix the engines, you generate the revenue, and the moment the company is liquidated, they unceremoniously drop you into the dirt. The London real estate is sold to the highest bidder. The local mansions are shared among the elite. The foreign currency is wired to offshore accounts. And the worker is handed a piece of paper, told to stand in the sun and wait for a bank alert that will never arrive. This is not a failure of administration. It is a highly successful extraction. This dossier exposes the true value of a government promise. If this forensic breakdown of the Nigeria Airways liquidation changed how you view civil service and pensions, you must share it. Send it to someone who still believes that working for the government guarantees a safe retirement. We have exposed the oil, the banks, the courts, and the borders. But there is one massive industry that operates in the shadows, controlling the very land you live on. If you want us to open the files on the real estate cartel, how the elites launder billions through Eco-Atlantic and Banana Island, make sure you hit the subscribe button right now. Leave a comment below. Do you know anyone who worked for a liquidated government company like Nigeria Airways or Nitel? Did they ever get their full money? Let's read the records together. You are watching Historic Capital. The truth is in the transactions. Follow the money.